The cabin of Flight 782 hummed with the familiar, comforting vibration of a large jet slicing through the upper atmosphere at 30,000 feet. Passengers leaned back in their seats, headphones on, blankets pulled up, conversations flowing gently like soft background music. It was the kind of mid-cruise calm that made even nervous travelers relax, lulled by the illusion that flights were always smooth. Predictable chapters between destinations. Among the 412 passengers on board sat Mira, a 22-year-old engineering graduate returning home from an 8-month internship in Stockholm. She sat by the window in row 19, watching the endless carpet of white clouds below her. Her mind drifted from her family waiting at the airport to the exciting job offer she hoped to receive soon. She felt hopeful, light, almost floating. A flight attendant passed by offering drinks. Mira accepted a cup of orange juice with a smile and settled deeper into her seat. Around her, a toddler giggled at a cartoon on his tablet. An elderly couple dozed hand in hand, and a businessman typed furiously on a laptop. Everything felt so normal, and then everything didn't. It began with something small. The captain's voice didn't appear for the scheduled mid-flight announcement. Normally, he gave updates about altitude, weather ahead, expected landing time. But now there was only a quiet crackle of static and then silence. Passengers barely noticed at first, but the cabin crew did. A senior flight attendant named Lara walked briskly toward the cockpit. The other attendants exchanged glances, tight, uneasy. Mira noticed the shift immediately. She had always been good at reading people and the expressions on their faces were far from routine. Minutes passed. The curtain separating the galley from the main cabin swayed as crew members slipped behind it in hurried movements. Whispered voices floated out too low to make out words, but unmistakably anxious. Then came the first real break in the calm. A sharp chime rang from the overhead panel, followed by the intercom clicking on. But instead of the captain, the co-pilot's strained voice filled the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. A member of our crew is experiencing a medical emergency. We are managing the situation. The message was vague, but the tone tight. Breathless carried enough weight to crush the cabin's composure. Mira's heart tightened. She sat upright, unblinking, as a flight attendant hurriedly made her way down the aisle, heading toward the back where a doctor who had identified himself earlier was seated. A murmur of questions rippled through the rows. What happened? Is someone hurt? Should we be worried? The doctor followed the attendant forward. Before the curtain fell shut again, Mira saw something, a glimpse of panic in the crew's eyes that no reassurances could hide. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. The quiet grew heavier, pressing on every passenger like an invisible weight. Finally. The co-pilot's voice returned, but now it trembled. Is there a medical professional seated anywhere on the aircraft who can assist us in the cockpit? Please press your call button. The doctor had already gone forward. That meant this was something else. Without thinking, Mira unbuckled her seatbelt slightly, leaning into the aisle, trying to see what was happening. A flight attendant was kneeling near the cockpit door. 2 others were passing medical equipment, forward oxygen tank, defibrillator, emergency med kit. Even from a distance, Mira saw the urgency in their movements. The doctor emerged briefly, his face grave. He whispered to the head attendant, who paled instantly. A chill swept down Mira's spine. Seconds later, whispers erupted throughout the cabin as the awful truth leaked out like smoke. The pilot wasn't just sick. He was unresponsive. A few passengers began to cry softly. Others grabbed their phones, gripping them like lifelines, though there was no signal at this altitude. A man in seat 32 muttered prayers under his breath. A mother hugged her teenage daughter as turbulence rattled the overhead bins. Through the cockpit door, Mira heard snippets of frantic voices. Pulse is fading. Clear the airway. Try again. Captain? 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 And then the flat, dreadful silence that followed. The plane continued forward, smooth on the outside, but inside, the illusion of safety had cracked wide open. Passengers clutched armrests as fear seeped through the aisles. The sky outside remained calm and blue, but inside the aircraft, panic brewed like a storm waiting to break. Mira stared at the cockpit door, a gnawing feeling rising in her chest, a feeling she didn't yet understand, but one that would soon change the fate of everyone on board. Because at 30,000 feet, with one pilot gone and a storm forming ahead, Flight 782 was no longer just a routine flight. It had become a ticking clock. And Mira would soon be the one standing between life and catastrophe. The cabin buzzed with a fragile, uneasy tension. Fear had not yet erupted into chaos, but it hovered like static in the air, ready to ignite at the slightest spark. The co-pilot had not spoken again since the ominous message asking for medical assistance in the cockpit. No updates. No reassurances. Only silence and the steady drone of engines cutting through the sky. Mira's pulse thrummed in her ears. She kept her eyes fixed on the cockpit door, trying to read every small sign the crew gave. Lara, the senior flight attendant, emerged from behind the curtain with trembling hands as she steadied the beverage cart, though she wasn't serving anyone. She was just standing there, eyes unfocused, as if she were physically present but mentally worlds away. Finally, she took a deep breath and stepped into the center aisle. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, trying for professional calm, but failing to hide the shakiness in her voice. Please remain seated. We will provide an update soon. We thank you for your patience. The passengers didn't argue, but the atmosphere only tightened. People exchanged worried glances. Some reached for each other's hands. The toddler who had been giggling earlier now whimpered, sensing the fear clouding the room. Mira's engineering mind kept spinning through possibilities. If the pilot was unconscious and not responding to treatment, then the co-pilot, who was much younger, maybe even newly promoted, would be alone up front. Alone to fly through worsening weather. Alone to navigate turbulence. Alone to land a massive airliner with more than 400 souls on board. That's too much for one person, she thought. Even she knew that much. Her chest tightened. A loud ding sounded again from the overhead speakers. The intercom clicked. This time, before the co-pilot even spoke, Mira felt her breath lock. Ladies and gentlemen, I need everyone to remain calm. His voice trembled, controlled, but undeniably strained. Our captain is unresponsive, and we are continuing attempts to revive him. At this time, his voice cracked. He paused. A shuffling sound came through the speaker, as if he'd covered the microphone while collecting himself. At this time, I am the sole pilot in control of the aircraft. A wave of gasps swept through the cabin. The co-pilot continued. I need to focus fully on the aircraft. If there is anyone on board, anyone with flying experience, even basic aviation knowledge, please notify the cabin crew immediately. Another gasp. A louder one. Someone in the back cried openly. A man whispered, God help us, as his wife clung to his arm. Lara and the other attendants walked briskly down the aisles, scanning each seat for any raised hands, any volunteers, any miracle. None. A middle-aged man who had been a private pilot decades ago raised his hand halfway but lowered it just as quickly. "I haven't flown in 20 years, he muttered, face pale. "Not a plane like this. I can't." Rows 1 through 40 held nothing but terrified faces. Mira swallowed hard. Asterisk, should she say something? Her experience wasn't real flight training, only simulation work from a university research project. She had built a simplified cockpit interface. She had studied aerodynamics and basic flight systems. She understood instrumentation, throttle response, yaw, pitch, roll. But she had never physically flown anything. Asterisk still. She knew something dangerous. Asterisk, a commercial airliner cannot rely indefinitely on a single pilot, especially during storms, emergencies, or medical crises. Asterisk, the co-pilot needed help. Not to fly the plane alone, but to manage tasks, monitor instruments, handle radio communication, and reduce his overwhelming workload. Asterisk, Mira felt her legs moving before she decided to stand. She rose halfway, heart pounding. Then she froze. What? If I make things worse? What if I interfere? What if the co-pilot gets distracted? What if I'm wrong? What if asterisk, a sudden jolt of turbulence rocked the aircraft sharply to the right, forcing her back into her seat? Gasps and cries echoed across the cabin. Luggage rattled in the overhead compartments. Even the seasoned attendants had to grab onto seatbacks for support. Asterisk, another tremor smaller, but enough to confirm the truth. They were entering the outer edges of a storm, and the co-pilot was alone in the cockpit. Asterisk. When the plane steadied, Mira found her courage strangely more stable than before. Maybe it was adrenaline. Maybe it was the realization that fear was now the only thing keeping anyone safe. She stood again. Lara noticed her. "Miss, are you okay?" Asterisk, Mira began, voice cracking. She took a breath and lifted her chin. "I think I can help." A few passengers turned toward her with surprise, hope, or confusion. "Are you a pilot?" Lara whispered urgently. Asterisk, "No." Mira admitted, "But I have aviation training, technical training. I've worked with full flight simulation systems. I understand instrumentation. I can read everything on a flight deck. I can follow whatever the co-pilot needs." Asterisk, Lara's eyes widened, not in doubt, but in something like relief. A lifeline in a storm. "Come with me," she said, as Mira followed her toward the cockpit. Every pair of eyes in the cabin tracked her movement. For a moment, the fear lifting from their faces felt like a weight settling onto her own shoulders. Asterisk. She reached the cockpit door just as another rumble of turbulence hit the plane. Asterisk. The co-pilot looked over his shoulder, pale and drenched in sweat. "Please tell me you can help," he said, and Mira stepped forward. The cockpit of Flight 782 was a world unlike anything Mira had ever stepped into, alive with blinking lights, urgent alarms, glowing screens, and a dense atmosphere of pressure. The air felt heavier here, as if fear itself had masked. Asterisk, the co-pilot, First Officer Daniel Hart, looked barely older than 30. Sweat trickled down the side of his face, and his hands were clenched white around the yoke. His breathing was fast but controlled, just enough to keep panic from taking over. Asterisk. "Mira, right?" he said quickly, eyes darting between her and the instruments. "Please, sit here, co-pilot seat." Asterisk. The word startled her. She hesitated only a fraction of a second before sliding into the seat next to him. The leather was warm from the missing captain who had sat there not long ago, commanding the flight with decades of experience that now lay motionless behind them, covered with a blanket by the doctor. Asterisk. Mira swallowed the lump rising in her throat. Asterisk. Daniel pointed rapidly at the displays in front of her. "I need you to monitor altitude right here. Airspeed here. And vertical speed, this one. Asterisk, she nodded, her eyes locking onto the instruments, absorbing every symbol like she had trained for this moment all her life. Asterisk, a fresh alarm chimed. Sharp and piercing. Asterisk, wind shear ahead, Daniel muttered. Great, of course. Asterisk, Mira's heart rate spiked. She had studied wind shear in simulations, rapid changes in wind direction that could destabilize an aircraft, especially during takeoff or landing. But at cruising altitude, combined with a storm, it could still throw the plane off course. Asterisk. I can help watch the drift, Mira said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. Asterisk. Daniel flicked a glance at her, brief but grateful. Do it. Asterisk. Another jolt shook the plane, harder this time. The cockpit rattled. Loose papers fluttered. The overhead panel clicked with sudden system adjustments. The sky outside the windshield darkened as thick storm clouds gathered ahead, gray and heavy like bruises across the atmosphere. Asterisk. Daniel kept speaking, rapid fire. Autopilot disengaged itself 2 minutes ago. Turbulence was too strong. I'm flying manual now. Asterisk. Mira inhaled sharply. You're doing this all alone? Asterisk. I was. Not anymore. She steadied her breath and focused. The radio crackled. Air traffic control finally chimed in, sounding urgent but calm enough to anchor the moment. Asterisk. Flight 782, we're tracking your weather corridor. Strong turbulence ahead. Advise status. Asterisk. Daniel didn't look away from the windshield. ATC, this is Hart. Captain is down. I repeat, Captain is down. I have a passenger assisting. Request vectors to nearest safe landing field. Asterisk. Copy. 782, diverting you to Roven Field International. Runway is clear. Emergency crews on standby. Asterisk. Mira's stomach clenched. That wasn't a normal diversion. That meant this was no longer a typical emergency. This was a race for survival. The plane lurched violently, pulling Mira forward against her harness. Warning lights flashed amber across the cockpit stall. Auto thrust limited, turbulence detected. Asterisk. Daniel gritted his teeth and fought the controls. The yoke pushed back hard, resisting each correction he made. Asterisk. Altitude dropping. Mira called out. Her voice wavered but stayed loud enough to cut through the chaos. Asterisk. Compensating, Daniel said, pushing the throttle forward. The engines roared, the nose lifting slightly. Asterisk. They hit another pocket of rough air. The aircraft shook like something enormous had struck it from below. Passengers screamed from behind the cockpit door. Mira clenched the edge of her seat, but forced herself to focus on the numbers. Asterisk. Vertical speed leveling. Airspeed stabilizing. You've got it, she said, guiding him through with data he couldn't afford to glance at. Asterisk. Good. Keep calling it out. Asterisk. For several long minutes, nothing existed except the instruments, the storm, and the two of them battling physics. With every ounce of strength they had. Asterisk. Then, suddenly the storm thickened into a swirling wall of darkness. Lightning flashed to their right, illuminating the clouds in stark, terrifying bursts. Asterisk. Mira gasped. Daniel's grip tightened. Asterisk. We can't go through that, she breathed. It's too dense. Asterisk. We don't have a choice unless you see. An open corridor, I don't. Asterisk. She scanned the displays, flipping through radar overlays. Left. 10 degrees. There's a thinner region. Asterisk. Daniel didn't question her. He adjusted the heading, and the aircraft groaned as it banked through. Turbulence. The nose dipped, then steadied. Asterisk. The radar confirmed it. The left side had marginally clearer conditions. It wasn't safe, but it was survivable. Asterisk. Nice call, Daniel said. Keep scanning. Lightning cracked again, brighter. Then, just as Mira felt her resolve fray, the clouds began to thin. A faint glow appeared ahead, subtle but real. Daniel exhaled shakily. We're through the worst of it. The turbulence eased. The violent shaking softened into smaller jolts, then into steady rumbling. The alarms began to shut off one by one. The storm was behind them. But the hardest part was still ahead. Mira looked at Daniel. We still have to get this plane on the ground. He nodded grimly. Yeah, and we'll do it together. The storm was now a bruised memory behind them, but the cockpit remained thick with tension. Survival was no longer about staying airborne, it was about getting hundreds of lives safely back onto solid ground. And the runway that air traffic control had directed them to Rovenfield International was fast approaching. Mira stared at the glowing runway indicators on her screen, each one representing a mile closer to the moment they would either triumph or fail. Daniel inhaled, slowly, wiping a shaky hand across his forehead. Okay, descent checklist. Mira nodded. She straightened, forcing her mind to quiet. She wasn't a pilot. She had no flight hours logged. But she knew systems, she knew the logic behind every control, and she knew that Daniel needed her to function like a true first officer. She read from the digital checklist on the console. Altimeters. Set. Daniel confirmed. Flaps to 1. Flaps to 1. Through the windshield, the clouds finally broke, revealing the faint curve of the horizon and a patchwork of land far below. The runway lights shimmered like a thin silver thread against the earth. Daniel exhaled. There it is. Mira felt her heart leap into her throat. The airport. The real, solid earth. Safety. Hope. And yet, landing a massive commercial jet was an entirely different beast than flying one. You won't let me stall, right? Daniel said with a strained attempt at humor. I won't let anything happen. Mira said, though her stomach twisted at the weight of her own promise. The radio crackled to life. Flight 782, you are cleared for final approach. Emergency. Crews are in position. Copy that. Daniel answered, his voice steady but tight. Beginning final descent. The plane dipped, nose angled downward, and Mira watched the numbers shift rapidly, altitude ticking lower, airspeed adjusting, wind drifting across the radar. Every variable mattered. Every miscalculation could be catastrophic. Speed slightly high, Mira announced, correcting. Wind from the west at 12 knots. Adjusting yaw. Another jolt of turbulence hit, not severe, but enough to remind everyone that even clear skies could carry dangers. Daniel tightened his grip on the yoke. Okay, Mira. Flaps 2. Flaps 2. She moved the lever carefully. The aircraft responded with a mechanical whir that vibrated under her feet. The runway grew larger, still distant, but no longer a faint line. Mira imagined the people below, the emergency vehicles waiting, the entire ground crew holding their breath. She checked the captain's seat, still empty, blanket covered. The sight made her swallow hard. They were truly on their own. Altitude. 1,500 feet, she said. Vertical speed nominal. Daniel nodded. Gear down. Mira lowered the landing gear. A heavy clunk followed, then 3 green lights blinked on, one after another. Gear is down and locked. Good. The cabin behind them was silent. Not a sound escaped from the hundreds of terrified passengers, as if the entire aircraft were collectively holding its breath. Only the engine spoke low, thunderous, powerful. Asterisk. Final approach, Daniel said. We're committed now. No go around. No second chances. Mira's breath trembled. Daniel, whatever happens. Thank you for trusting me. Asterisk, he offered a thin, tired smile. Thank you for stepping up. You saved us before we even get to the ground. Asterisk, another gust of crosswind pushed the plane sideways. Daniel compensated quickly, but the wings rocked slightly. Wind gusting, Mira warned. Got it. Asterisk. Altitude 800 feet. Asterisk. Airspeed. Stable. Asterisk. Vertical speed within limits. Asterisk. The runway lights now shined like stars beneath them, bright and unmistakable. The plane aligned almost perfectly with the center line. Asterisk. Flaps full. Daniel said softly. Asterisk. Mira's hand shook, but she set the flaps to landing position. The aircraft slowed, nose slightly lifted. Asterisk. 500. The automated radio altimeter called out. Asterisk. Daniel took a deep breath. Bring us home. Asterisk. Mira focused on the readings. Speed good. Glide slope good. Asterisk. The engines roared softly as Daniel made tiny, precise adjustments. Yoke left, yoke right, throttle back, pitch up. The plane drifted slightly. Mira called. It out. Asterisk. Left drift 3 degrees. Asterisk. Correcting. Asterisk. 400. Asterisk. The ground rose toward them. Mira's pulse hammered. She whispered to herself, Please. Asterisk. 300. The runway markings were now crystal clear. 200. Asterisk. Daniel's voice dropped, almost calm. Almost there. Asterisk. 100. Asterisk. The plane felt heavier, wheels craving. The earth. Asterisk. 50. Mira could barely breathe. 40. 30. 20. Hold. Hold. Asterisk. The aircraft kissed the runway, not a perfect landing, but smooth enough to draw a wave of gasps and sobs from the cabin. The plane bounced gently. Once, then settled with a deep mechanical sigh. The wheels roared as Daniel deployed reverse thrust, slowing the massive jet down the runway. Asterisk. Emergency lights flashed along the tarmac as fire trucks and ambulances tailed them. Asterisk. And then the plane stopped. A deafening silence followed. Asterisk. Then an eruption. Asterisk. Cheers. Cries. Applause that shook the aircraft as hard as any turbulence. Passengers hugged each other, sobbing with relief. Some whispered prayers of gratitude. Others simply collapsed back into their seats, overwhelmed. Asterisk. Daniel leaned back, covering his face with both hands. His shoulders trembled. Asterisk. Mira exhaled for what felt like the first time in an hour. Asterisk. You did it, she whispered. Asterisk. He shook his head and looked at her with tired, grateful eyes. We did. Asterisk. When they finally opened the cockpit door, hundreds of eyes turned toward Mira. She was no longer just a young woman returning home. Asterisk. To them, she was the reason they were standing on solid ground again. Asterisk. A hero, one who had reached out through fear and found courage at 30,000 feet.